Hello and welcome to today's reflection. Excuse my croaky voice, I've got a bit of a cold. Chip pans are the most common cause of house fires in the United Kingdom, and according to Wikipedia, such fires result in over 4,000 injuries and tragically about 50 deaths a year. You see, when a chip pan catches fire, if you don't know better, it can be tempting to use the usual method of putting out a fire, that is to pour on water. But as many of you will know, pouring water on a burning chip pan has the opposite effect to that desired. You see, the water sinks to the bottom of the burning oil and instantly vaporizes, and it ejects the oil out of the pan, causing a huge and extremely dangerous fireball. Well, the book of Acts is full of stories of those trying to extinguish the fire of the gospel by persecuting Christians. But those efforts are like pouring water on a chip pan. You see, the flames of faith just explode out, and explode out geographically. We see this particularly in our passage today. Paul and Silas in yesterday's passage have been beaten up by the authorities in Philippi and effectively forced to leave. Just an interesting little aside here is at this point in the narrative, the story changes from "we were going," which includes the author Luke, to "they," Paul and Silas, left Philippi, perhaps suggesting that Luke may have stayed behind for a while in Philippi to support the new church there. But Paul and Silas move on to Thessalonica and Berea, two towns in what is now northern Greece. So let's hear the account of what happened in those towns. Acts chapter 17, reading verses 1 to 15. When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. "This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is the Messiah," he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas, in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They're defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil, and they put Jason and the others in jail, Jason and the others on bail, and let them go. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea, and on arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the Scriptures every day to see what Paul said was true, And as a result, many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. But when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God in Berea, some of them went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up. The believers immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed at Berea. Those who escorted Paul brought him to Athens, then left with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. It's a great message of how the church is growing. Paul and Silas follow their usual practice of speaking first to Jews in the synagogues. And what's really encouraging is that even though Paul and Silas only get to stay around for 3 weeks in Thessalonica, some of the Jews respond in faith. The response is even big from the God-fearing Greeks, those people who hadn't been converted to Judaism but still believed in God and respected the moral and ethical teaching of the Jews. They came to faith too. Yet the majority of Jews felt threatened by Paul's teaching and stirred up a mob, forcing Paul and Silas to leave. It must have been pretty traumatic for those early missionaries, Paul and Silas, and the new believers as well, including people like Jason. But the effect was that a new church was founded in Thessalonica. And if you read Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, which is possibly one of the earliest of all the New Testament documents, you can discover that in Thessalonica there was a church that held firm to the gospel despite persecution. And in my own Christian life, it was reading accounts like this in our passage today and letters like Paul wrote to the Thessalonians that brought alive to me the historical reality of those first Christians living out their Christian faith wholeheartedly, despite the cost. It brought alive to me that the Christian message is not some myth, but the message of real people passing on what they knew to be true and willing to suffer for it. And Paul and Silas are far from deterred from their experience in Thessalonica. They just move on 50 miles or so to the next town of Berea, and they teach there. And a church is established, a new group of believers in that town. But of course the message gets back to those antagonistic Jews in Thessalonica, and they come and cause trouble for Paul and Silas and Timothy, who is now in Berea. But the result is simply that Paul moves on to Athens, that great cultural capital. God is growing his church, spreading the flames of the gospel. Well, it can be the same today. It's often when the pressure is on that there is spiritual growth. You see, when it's easy to be a Christian, we can become spiritually flabby. But when it's hard, it can test our faith, test our endurance, test our commitment. Our muscles grow by exercise, by being used. I think of the church in China during the Cultural Revolution of the 1950s, 60s and 70s. Many of the churches were forced to close. Western missionaries were forced to leave. And some feared for the Christian church. But the church didn't die. It just went underground. And when things began to open up in the 1980s and 90s, it became clear that despite the pressure, the church had grown massively. There are now at least 60 million Christians in China. And of course, in some areas, they're facing persecution again. And today, the church, with the whole world, not just in China, but in this country too, is under pressure from the pandemic. Both because we're not able to meet in the ways we've met before, but also in some places because church finances are under threat. But I do not despair because of pressure. I just pray that that pressure will lead to greater commitment, like it did in those first century Christians. I pray that we'll be like those Christians who keep on going despite the struggles we face. And I pray that any water poured on the flames of our faith, by whatever means, whether it be by people or just the circumstances, may be like water on a chip pan, which greatly increases the fire of Christian love and hope burning in us.